On a busy Tuesday afternoon, 12-year-old Marcus Thompson sat in his 7th grade math class, trying to focus on the equations written on the whiteboard. The autumn sunlight streamed through the classroom windows, but something didn't feel right. His chest felt tight, and each breath seemed harder than the last. Marcus raised his hand, his voice barely a whisper as he told his teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, that he couldn't breathe properly. The experienced teacher recognized the signs immediately. Marcus was having an asthma attack. She'd been briefed about his condition at the start of the school year and knew this was serious. Sarah Thompson, Marcus's mother, was in the middle of examining a young patient at Children's Hope Hospital, where she worked as a pediatrician, when her phone buzzed with the school's emergency number. Her heart skipped a beat as she quickly excused herself to take the call. Dr. Thompson, this is Riverside Middle School. Marcus is having trouble breathing. We've already used his rescue inhaler, but it's not helping as much as it should, the school nurse explained, her voice calm but urgent. Sarah's medical training kicked in, pushing aside her panic as a mother. I'll be there in 10 minutes. If his condition worsens before I arrive, call an ambulance immediately. She quickly arranged for another doctor to take over her patients and rushed to her car. When Sarah arrived at the school, she found Marcus sitting in the nurse's office, his shoulders hunched forward, struggling to draw in each breath. His usual bright smile was replaced by a look of fear, and his dark brown skin had taken on a grayish tinge, a dangerous sign that he wasn't getting enough oxygen. "Baby, I'm here," Sarah said, quickly kneeling beside her son. She pulled out her stethoscope and listened to his lungs. The whistling sound she heard confirmed her fears. This was one of the worst attacks he'd had in years. The school nurse had done everything by the book, using the rescue inhaler, keeping Marcus calm, and having him sit upright. But Sarah knew her son needed emergency care. As both a doctor and a mother, she recognized that this attack was different from the usual ones they managed at home. "We need to get to the hospital," Sarah announced, helping Marcus to his feet. The school nurse offered to call an ambulance, but Sarah knew they'd reach City General Hospital faster in her car. It was only 5 minutes away. During the drive, Sarah kept glancing at Marcus through her rearview mirror. He sat in the back seat, leaning forward slightly, the position that made it easiest to breathe. His hands gripped the seat belt, knuckles turning pale with each labored breath. Sarah tried to keep her voice steady as she spoke to him. "Remember what we practiced, Marcus. In through your nose, out through your mouth. Nice and slow." As a doctor, she taught countless children how to manage their asthma. But watching her own son struggle made her medical knowledge feel somehow inadequate. They had managed Marcus's asthma successfully for years. He took his daily controller medications, used his rescue inhaler when needed, and they had a clear action plan for emergencies. Sarah had even helped him become one of the best runners on his school's track team, proving that asthma didn't have to limit his dreams. But today was different. The rescue inhaler hadn't provided its usual relief, and his symptoms were getting worse instead of better. Sarah knew they needed help, and they needed it fast. As they pulled into the emergency room parking lot of City General Hospital, Sarah's mind raced through the symptoms she would report. Severe persistent asthma, rescue inhaler not providing relief, increased work of breathing, and decreased peak flow readings from the school nurse's assessment. What Sarah didn't know as she helped Marcus out of the car was that their visit to City General would become much more than a medical emergency. The next few minutes would set in motion a chain of events that would change not only their lives but the lives of countless other families in their community. Marcus stumbled slightly as they walked toward the emergency room doors, and Sarah wrapped her arm around his waist to steady him. "We're almost there, baby," she whispered, trying to hide the tremor in her voice. "Just a few more steps." The automatic doors of the emergency room slid open, welcoming them into the brightly lit waiting area. Sarah Thompson had no way of knowing that she was about to face not just a medical crisis, but a fight for justice that would shake the entire hospital system to its core. The emergency room at City General Hospital was surprisingly quiet that afternoon. Only a few patients sat in the waiting area, some scrolling through their phones while others stared blankly at the muted TV mounted on the wall. The smell of disinfectant hung heavy in the air as Sarah Thompson rushed to the front desk, supporting Marcus, who was still struggling to breathe. "My son needs immediate medical attention," Sarah explained to the receptionist, her voice clear and professional. "He's having a severe asthma attack that isn't responding to his rescue inhaler." She quickly pulled out her insurance card and her hospital ID badge, hoping to speed up the process. The receptionist, a young woman named Jenny, began typing information into her computer. She glanced at Marcus with concern, noting his labored breathing and the way he leaned heavily against the counter. Within minutes, she handed Sarah some forms and assured her that a nurse would be out soon to assess Marcus. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Sarah watched as 2 other patients who had arrived after them were called back. Her worry turned to anger when she saw Marcus's lips starting to take on a slight bluish tint, a dangerous sign of oxygen deprivation that any medical professional should recognize as an emergency. Finally, a nurse called them back for triage. She took Marcus's vital signs, frowning at his rapid breathing and low oxygen levels. "The doctor will see you shortly," she promised, leading them to a small examination room with mint green walls and outdated medical posters. Dr. James Werner entered the room 30 minutes later, barely looking up from the tablet in his hands. He was a tall man in his 50s, with graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses. His white coat was pristinely pressed, but his demeanor was anything but warm. "So, what brings you here today?" he asked, still not making eye contact with either Sarah or Marcus. Before Sarah could explain, Marcus started coughing, a harsh, wheezing sound that echoed in the small room. Sarah stepped forward, her doctor's instincts taking over. "My son is having a severe asthma attack. He's used his rescue inhaler 3 times in the past hour with minimal improvement. His O2 stats are dropping, and he's showing signs of cyanosis." Dr. Werner finally looked up, his eyes narrowing as they moved from Sarah to Marcus. "Are you sure it's not just anxiety? These kids today get worked up over nothing. Maybe he's just nervous about a test at school." Sarah felt her blood pressure rising. "I'm Dr. Sarah Thompson, pediatrician at Children's Hope. This is not anxiety. My son has documented severe asthma, and he needs immediate intervention." "Doctor?" Werner's eyebrows raised slightly. "Well, if you're a doctor, then you should know better than to rush to the ER for every little breathing issue. The urgent care down the street handles these cases all the time." Marcus slumped further in his chair, his breathing becoming more labored. Sarah noticed a sheen of sweat on his forehead despite the cool room temperature. She pulled out her phone and started recording. "Are you refusing to treat my son?" she asked clearly, her voice steady despite her growing fear and anger. "I'm suggesting you're overreacting," Dr. Werner replied, already turning toward the door. "Take him to urgent care. They can handle his situation." The pause before the last word spoke volumes. Sarah stood up, her full height matching Dr. Werner's. "I want your full name and license number, and I want it noted in his chart that you're refusing to treat a child in respiratory distress. I also want another doctor in here immediately. Security can show you to urgent care if you're going to be difficult about this," Dr. Werner said coldly, reaching for the door handle. Just then, Marcus's coughing intensified, and he slid sideways in his chair. Sarah rushed to catch him, her heart pounding as she noticed his lips had turned a darker shade of blue. Through the open door, she saw a nurse passing by and called out desperately, "I need help. My son can't breathe." The nurse, an older woman with kind eyes, took one look at Marcus and rushed into action. "I'm getting Dr. Chen," she announced, hurrying from the room. Dr. Werner stood in the doorway, his face a mask of indifference. "You're making a scene over nothing," he started to say, and was cut off by a commanding voice from behind him. "Step aside, Dr. Werner." Dr. Patricia Chen, the chief of medicine, strode into the room, her presence filling the small space with authority. The next 7 minutes would change everything at City General Hospital, but not in the way anyone expected. Dr. Patricia Chen's presence transformed the small examination room instantly. She was a shorter woman in her mid-40s, with short black hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. While Dr. Werner stood frozen in the doorway, she quickly assessed the situation before her. "Get me a nebulizer with albuterol and ipratropium, stat," she ordered the nurse who had called her, "and page respiratory therapy." Her voice was calm but carried unmistakable authority. The next 7 minutes unfolded like a perfectly choreographed emergency response. Dr. Chen moved with practiced efficiency, listening to Marcus's chest with her stethoscope while speaking softly to him. "You're going to be okay, young man. We're going to help you breathe better right now." Sarah stood nearby, still recording everything on her phone, her hand trembling slightly as she watched Dr. Chen work. The contrast between the two doctors' approaches was stark. Where Dr. Werner had shown dismissal and contempt, Dr. Chen demonstrated urgency and care. Severe bronchospasm, Dr. Chen announced, her stethoscope moving across Marcus's back. O2 status down to 89%. Let's get him on oxygen immediately. The nurse rushed in with the requested equipment, and within seconds, they had Marcus on a nebulizer treatment with oxygen support. Dr. Werner finally found his voice. I was just about to suggest. Step outside, Dr. Werner. Dr. Chen cut him off without even looking up. We'll discuss this later. Her tone left no room for argument. The older doctor's face reddened, but he backed out of the room. The nebulizer hummed steadily as medication-laden mist flowed into Marcus's airways. Within minutes, his breathing began to ease slightly. The bluish tint of his lips started to fade, and his oxygen levels slowly climbed. Dr. Chen turned to Sarah, her expression professional but compassionate. Dr. Thompson, I understand you're recording this incident. Please continue. I want you to document everything that happened here today. She paused, making direct eye contact with Sarah. And I want you to know that this is not how we practice medicine at City General. Sarah nodded, tears of relief and lingering anger in her eyes. He could have died, she said quietly, watching Marcus's chest rise and fall with slightly less effort now, if that nurse hadn't seen us. But he didn't, and he won't. Dr. Chen assured her firmly. I'm ordering admission for overnight observation. We'll start him on systemic steroids and continue breathing treatments. She turned to Marcus with a gentle smile. How's that breathing feeling now, young man? Marcus managed a weak thumbs up, the nebulizer mask still covering his face. Some color had returned to his cheeks, and his shoulders were no longer heaving with each breath. Outside the room, there was increasing activity. The respiratory therapist arrived with additional equipment, and Dr. Chen efficiently brought them up to speed on Marcus's condition. Sarah noticed several hospital administrators gathering in the hallway, speaking in hushed but urgent tones. The nurse who had called Dr. Chen returned with a tablet. Dr. Chen, I pulled up some relevant information you should see. She handed over the tablet, and Dr. Chen's expression grew increasingly serious as she scrolled through whatever was on the screen. Dr. Thompson, she said after a moment, would you be willing to make a formal statement once Marcus is stable? It seems we have some serious matters to address. Sarah looked at her son, now resting more comfortably as the medication did its work. Yes, she replied firmly. This can happen to another child. Dr. Chen nodded, her expression determined. It won't. Not at my hospital. She turned to the nurse. Janet, please contact legal and HR. We're going to need them. Then, addressing Sarah again, I'm staying personally involved in Marcus's care. We'll get him moved to a room shortly, and I want hourly updates on his condition. As if to punctuate the gravity of the situation, they could hear Dr. Werner's raised voice from somewhere down the hall, apparently protesting to someone about his authority being questioned. Dr. Chen's eyes narrowed at the sound. Those 7 minutes had changed everything. What started as a medical emergency had exposed something far more systemic, and Dr. Chen's response made it clear that there would be consequences. Marcus dozed off as the medication continued to work, his breathing finally settling into a more normal rhythm. Sarah sat beside him, still recording, her doctor's mind already cataloging everything that had happened. She didn't know it yet, but the next 24 hours would bring changes that would reshape not just City General, but healthcare practices across the entire state. By evening, Marcus was resting in a private room on the pediatric floor. The steady beeping of his heart monitor provided a reassuring backdrop as Sarah sat beside his bed, her phone now connected to a charger but still recording. The last few hours had been a whirlwind of activity, both medical and administrative. Down the hall in the hospital's main conference room, Dr. Chen sat at a large table surrounded by hospital board members, legal representatives, and HR personnel. On the screen before them, security footage from the emergency room played silently, showing Dr. Werner's dismissive treatment of Marcus and Sarah. This isn't an isolated incident, Janet, the nurse who had helped save Marcus, explained to the group. She pulled out a thick folder of patient complaints. I've been collecting these for months. Dr. Werner has a pattern of treating minority patients differently. Most of them just gave up and left when he dismissed them. The hospital's legal team looked through the complaints, their expressions growing more concerned with each page. One of them, a woman named Maria Rodriguez, spoke up. "We have at least 30 documented cases here of similar behavior. This is a serious liability issue." Dr. Chen nodded grimly. "It's more than a liability issue. It's a complete violation of everything we stand for as healthcare providers." She turned to the HR director. "I want his previous performance reviews pulled. All of them." Back in Marcus's room, several other nurses had stopped by to check on him. Each one seemed to have a story about Dr. Werner. One nurse, an older man named James, quietly told Sarah about a Hispanic child with appendicitis who had almost suffered a rupture because Dr. Werner had insisted it was just stomach upset. "We tried reporting him before," James explained, checking Marcus's IV. "But he's been here so long, and he's friends with some of the board members. Nothing ever stuck." Sarah listened intently, making notes on her tablet. Her training as a doctor and her rage as a mother fueled her determination. "Well, this time we have evidence," she said, gesturing to her still recording phone. "And this time, he picked the wrong family to discriminate against." Around midnight, Dr. Chen came to check on Marcus personally. His breathing had improved significantly, and his oxygen levels were stable. As she examined him, she spoke quietly to Sarah. "The board is meeting in emergency session tomorrow morning," she informed her. "We're going to need your statement, and if you're willing, your video evidence." She paused, making sure Marcus was still sleeping. "There's more, Dr. Thompson, a lot more. We've uncovered a pattern of discriminatory behavior going back years." Sarah straightened in her chair. "I want to be at that meeting." "I was hoping you'd say that," Dr. Chen replied. "As both a mother and a medical professional, your testimony will carry significant weight." And she hesitated, then continued. "We found some disturbing statistics about patient outcomes under Dr. Werner's care. The disparities are significant." Just then, Marcus stirred in his sleep, and both doctors instinctively turned to check on him. His oxygen levels remained steady, his breathing even. Sarah reached out to smooth his blanket, her hand lingering protectively over his chest. "You know," Dr. Chen said softly, "when I first started here 15 years ago, I promised myself I'd never let prejudice affect patient care in my hospital. I thought we were doing better. I should have seen this sooner." Sarah met her eyes. "What matters is what we do now." Outside the room, the hospital continued its night routine, but there was an undercurrent of tension. Word had spread about the incident in the ER, and staff members were coming forward with their own stories. The night shift nurses were compiling their own records, and security was pulling months of camera footage. Dr. Werner, meanwhile, sat in his office, angrily typing out a letter defending his actions. He had no idea that his medical career was about to change dramatically, or that his decisions today would lead to a complete overhaul of emergency room protocols across the state. As the clock ticked past midnight, Marcus slept peacefully, his breathing finally normal. Sarah watched her son, her phone still recording, gathering evidence for the storm that would break in the morning. She didn't know it yet, but their experience would become a catalyst for change that would protect countless other families in the future. The next morning's board meeting would be just the beginning. The real revolution in patient care was about to start, and it would all trace back to those crucial 7 minutes in the emergency room when one doctor's prejudice met another doctor's principle. At exactly 8:00 a.m. the next morning, the hospital's main conference room was packed. Board members in expensive suits sat around the long oak table, while additional chairs lined the walls for other attendees. Sarah Thompson sat near the front, her tablet and phone ready with evidence. Marcus was still resting comfortably upstairs, watched over by Janet, the nurse who had helped save him. Dr. Chen stood at the head of the table, her usual white coat replaced by a formal business suit. Behind her, a large screen displayed statistics and charts. The room fell silent as she began to speak. "Yesterday, we witnessed something unacceptable in our emergency room," she began, her voice firm. "But as we investigated, we discovered this wasn't just one incident. What we found was shocking." She clicked to the first slide. It showed a graph of patient treatment times, clearly divided by race. The disparities were impossible to ignore. Dr. Werner's average time spent with white patients was 15 minutes. For patients of color, It averaged less than 3 minutes. These numbers don't lie, Dr. Chen continued. But it gets worse. She clicked to the next slide, showing readmission rates. Patients of color seen by Dr. Werner were 4 times more likely to return within 24 hours with worsening symptoms. Some ended up in intensive care. A murmur ran through the room. Sarah noticed several board members shifting uncomfortably in their seats. She recognized one of them as Dr. Werner's golfing buddy, mentioned in the nurses' reports. Dr. Werner sat at the far end of the table, his face red with anger. "This is ridiculous," he burst out. "You can't prove these numbers mean anything." "Actually, we can," said Maria Rodriguez from Legal, standing up. She distributed thick folders to each board member. "We have documented evidence of systematic discrimination. Patient complaints, nurse reports, security footage, and now Dr. Thompson's video from yesterday." Sarah connected her phone to the room's audio system. The recording played clearly, capturing Dr. Werner's dismissive tone and dangerous negligence. When it reached the part where he threatened to call security on them, several board members shook their heads in disbelief. Janet had come down from Marcus's room and now stood to speak. "I've worked in this ER for 12 years, she said. "What happened to Marcus yesterday happens all the time. The only difference is that this time, the patient's mother was a doctor who knew her rights and recorded everything." More hospital staff began sharing their stories. A resident described watching Dr. Werner dismiss a black child's broken arm as probably just a bruise. An administrator detailed how complaints about Dr. Werner mysteriously disappeared from official records. Dr. Werner's face had gone from red to pale. "This is a witch hunt," he shouted, standing up. "I've worked here for 20 years. You can't." "Sit down, James," the board chairman interrupted, his voice cold. "We've seen enough." He turned to Dr. Chen. "What are your recommendations?" Dr. Chen straightened her shoulders. "First, Dr. Werner's immediate suspension pending a full investigation by the medical board. Second, a complete overhaul of our ER protocols, including mandatory bias training and new oversight measures. Third, reaching out to all patients who may have received substandard care to offer follow-up services." Sarah stood up next, her voice steady. "I'm willing to help develop new training protocols, drawing on my experience both as a doctor and as the mother of a patient who almost died because of discrimination. But I want one more thing." She paused, making eye contact with each board member. "I want a patient advocacy office established here, with real power to investigate complaints." The room fell silent. The board chairman looked around at his colleagues, then nodded slowly. "All in favor?" Hands rose around the room. Even Dr. Werner's golfing buddy raised his hand, avoiding his friend's betrayed glare. "The motion passes," the chairman announced. "Dr. Werner, please surrender your hospital ID to security. Dr. Chen, you have full authority to implement these changes." Dr. Werner stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him, but nobody paid attention to his exit. They were too busy discussing the new protocols and changes that would reshape the hospital. As the meeting continued, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from Janet. "Marcus is asking for breakfast. His breathing is normal, and he's watching cartoons. We did it." Sarah smiled, but she knew this was just the beginning. The real work of changing the system was about to start. But for the first time, she felt hopeful that real change was possible. Sometimes, she realized, the best revenge wasn't about destruction. It was about building something better from the ashes of injustice. 1 month after the incident that changed City General Hospital forever, the emergency room looked very different. New signs in multiple languages welcomed patients, and a dedicated patient advocate desk stood prominently near the entrance. The changes weren't just physical. There was a new energy among the staff, a sense of pride in being part of something important. Marcus had fully recovered and was back at school, even returning to his beloved track team, but his experience had sparked a revolution in healthcare that was still spreading. Sarah Thompson sat in what used to be Dr. Werner's office, now transformed into the headquarters of the new Patient Advocacy Department, which she led part-time while maintaining her pediatric practice. Another hospital called today. Her assistant, Miguel, reported as he brought in a stack of papers. "They want to know more about our new protocols." It was the 5th such call this week. News of City General's transformation had spread quickly through the medical community. Sarah picked up a report from her desk. The numbers told an impressive story. In just 1 month, patient satisfaction scores had jumped by 40%. Treatment times were now consistent across all demographic groups, and emergency room wait times have been cut in half through better triage procedures. Down in the ER, Janet, now promoted to head emergency nurse, was training new staff on the updated protocols. Remember, she explained to the group, every patient gets the same high standard of care, no exceptions. If you see something wrong, our new reporting system protects whistleblowers. Dr. Chen walked through the ER, stopping to chat with patients and staff. She carried a tablet that showed real-time treatment statistics, part of the new Transparency Initiative. The screen displayed green across all categories. No disparities in wait times or treatment quality among different patient groups. Dr. Thompson, she called out, seeing Sarah passing through. Have you seen today's news? Sarah hadn't. She'd been busy meeting with former patients of Dr. Werner, helping them get follow-up care and documentation for their cases. Dr. Chen handed her a phone showing a news website. The headline read, State Medical Board revokes Dr. Werner's license following discrimination investigation. It's not just his license, Dr. Chen continued. The story mentions our new protocols as a model for other hospitals. The state legislature is considering making them mandatory for all emergency rooms. Sarah felt a mix of satisfaction and determination. The changes they'd fought for were spreading, but there was still work to do. She headed to her next appointment, a meeting with medical students who would be doing rotations in the new, reformed ER. In the hospital cafeteria, she overheard two nurses discussing a case from that morning. A young Spanish-speaking mother had brought in her feverish toddler. Under the old system, she might have faced language barriers and delays. Instead, she was immediately connected with a translator through the new video system, and her child received prompt care. Remember how it used to be? One nurse asked the other. We've come so far in just a month. Later that afternoon, Sarah visited Marcus at track practice. Watching him run around the track, breathing easily, she thought about all the other children who would now get the care they deserved. Her phone buzzed with a message from Dr. Chen. 3 more hospitals had reached out about implementing their protocols. Back at City General, the evening shift was starting. The new shift change procedure included a detailed review of all current patients, with special attention to any potential bias incidents or concerns. There hadn't been any reported in weeks, but they maintained vigilance. Janet approached Sarah as she returned to her office. You should see this, she said, holding out a letter. It was from a patient's family, thanking them for the care they received last week. They wrote that they felt respected and heard for the first time in a hospital. Sarah pinned the letter to what they called the change board, a wall full of positive feedback and success stories. Next to it hung a framed photo of Marcus in his hospital bed from that fateful day, a reminder of why they had fought so hard for change. As the sun set outside her office window, Sarah reviewed plans for next week's training session. The brutal revenge they'd gotten against discrimination wasn't about destroying one bad doctor. It was about building a better system for everyone. Dr. Werner's career was over, but more importantly, his replacement was a young doctor who had already embraced the new protocols enthusiastically. The real victory wasn't in punishment, but in progress. Every patient who received fair, equal care was part of that victory, and it grew bigger every day. 3 months after the incident at City General Hospital, Sarah Thompson stood at a podium in the state capitol building. Behind her sat Marcus, now fully healthy, alongside Dr. Chen, Janet, and dozens of other healthcare workers. The room was packed with legislators, reporters, and families who had their own stories of medical discrimination. Today, we're not just talking about one hospital or one doctor, Sarah began, her voice clear and confident. We're talking about changing healthcare across our entire state. She held up a thick document, the proposed Equal Care Act, which had become known informally as Marcus's Law. In the audience, Marcus watched his mother proudly. Just yesterday, he had won his first track meet since the asthma attack, setting a personal best time. His story had become a symbol of both what could go wrong in healthcare and how it could be fixed. Dr. Chen stepped up to the podium next, presenting the remarkable statistics from City General's transformation. In just 3 months, we've seen emergency room satisfaction rates rise to 95% across all patient groups. Our new protocols have been adopted by 12 other hospitals, all reporting similar improvements. The changes had spread far beyond what anyone expected. Local news stations had picked up the story, leading to investigations at other hospitals. Patients who had faced similar discrimination began speaking out, their voices finally being heard. Back at City General, Janet was giving a tour to administrators from a hospital in a neighboring state. The emergency room had become a model facility with its patient advocacy office, multilingual services, and transparent tracking system for treatment times and outcomes. This used to be just another ER, Janet explained to the visitors. Now we're showing that fair, equal care isn't just the right thing to do. It actually makes the whole hospital run better. She pointed to the real-time statistics display showing consistent treatment times across all patient groups. Meanwhile, the former Dr. Werner had tried to appeal his license revocation, but the evidence was overwhelming. His case had become a cautionary tale in medical ethics classes across the country. More importantly, his removal had made room for positive change. Sarah's phone buzzed during the legislative hearing, another message from a hospital wanting to implement their protocols. These requests had become so frequent that they created a standardized implementation package, complete with training materials and monitoring systems. Marcus, sitting in the hearing room, remembered the fear he'd felt that day in the emergency room. But now, looking around at all the people working to prevent similar incidents, he felt something different. Hope. He had even started talking about wanting to become a doctor himself someday. During a break in the hearing, families approached Sarah and Marcus to share their own stories. A mother told them about how City General's new protocols had saved her daughter's life last week. An elderly man described how the new advocacy office had helped him navigate a complex medical situation. Dr. Chen shared updated statistics with the legislative committee. We've seen a 60% reduction in return visits for worsening symptoms. Our average treatment times are down, while patient outcomes have improved across all demographics. These aren't just numbers. They represent real people getting the care they deserve. The proposed law would require all hospitals in the state to establish patient advocacy offices with real authority, implement bias training and monitoring systems, maintain transparent treatment statistics, provide multilingual services, create clear reporting procedures for discrimination, protect whistleblowers who report unfair treatment. As the hearing continued, news came in from another state considering similar legislation. The ripple effects of those 7 minutes in City General's ER were still spreading, touching more lives every day. Sarah concluded her testimony with a powerful statement. My son almost died because of medical discrimination, but instead of just getting angry, we chose to build something better. This law will ensure that no other family has to go through what we did. After the hearing, Marcus hugged his mother tightly. We did it, Mom, he whispered. Sarah smiled, knowing that doing it meant more than just changing one hospital or passing one law. It meant changing how people thought about healthcare equality. It meant turning a moment of discrimination into a movement for justice. As they left the Capitol building, reporters asked Marcus how it felt to have a law named after him. He thought for a moment before answering. It feels like we turned something bad into something good for everybody. The real revenge against discrimination had turned out to be creating positive change that would help thousands of people for years to come. Sometimes, the best way to fight darkness was by turning on the lights. 1 year after the incident that changed everything, City General Hospital hosted a special ceremony in its newly renovated lobby. A large plaque was being unveiled, commemorating the passing of Marcus's law and its implementation across the state. Marcus Thompson, now 13 and taller than he was a year ago, stood beside his mother as they pulled away the covering. The plaque read, "From this place, a movement for equal health care began." One patient's experience led to changes that saved countless lives, dedicated to all those who fought for fairness in medical care. Below these words was an engraved image of a stethoscope forming a heart shape. Dr. Patricia Chen, recently promoted to hospital director, addressed the gathered crowd. A year ago, discrimination nearly cost a young man his life in our emergency room. Today, we celebrate not just his survival, but the transformation that followed. 28 hospitals across 3 states now follow the protocols that began here. In the audience sat Janet, now the hospital's chief nursing officer, alongside dozens of healthcare workers who had helped implement the changes. The emergency room staff wore special badges marking them as Equality Care Certified, a new standard that had become prestigious in the medical community. Sarah Thompson stepped up to speak next. Her role had expanded beyond running the patient advocacy office. She now conducted training sessions nationwide. When I started recording on my phone that day, she said, I just wanted to protect my son. I never imagined we'd create a movement that would help so many families. The statistics displayed on the lobby's digital board told an impressive story. 100% equal treatment times across all patient groups. 0 discrimination complaints in the past 6 months. Patient satisfaction ratings at record highs. Emergency room efficiency improved by 50%. 15 other states considering similar legislation. Marcus had his own success to celebrate. His track team had won the state championship, and his story had inspired a new generation of young people to consider medical careers. He'd started a student group called Future Doctors for Equality at his school, with Dr. Chen as their mentor. The ceremony included a surprise announcement. The hospital was establishing the Marcus Thompson Scholarship, which would help minority students pursue medical degrees. The first recipient would be chosen the following year, when Marcus himself would be part of the selection committee. After the main ceremony, Sarah led tours of the transformed emergency room. The changes were striking, from the welcoming multilingual signs to the transparent tracking system showing treatment times and outcomes. Every examination room now had a poster explaining patient rights and how to report concerns. The former Dr. Werner's story had also reached its conclusion. His appeal had been denied, and he had moved to another state. But more importantly, his replacement, Dr. Maya Patel, had become a leader in implementing the new equality protocols. She often said, "We learned what not to do, and then we built something better." During the reception that followed, families shared their experiences with the new system. A grandmother told how she had received prompt, respectful care during a heart scare. A Spanish-speaking father described how the translation services had helped him understand his child's treatment perfectly. Marcus spent time talking with young patients in the pediatric ward, sharing his story and showing them his track medals. Bad things can lead to good changes, he told them. Sometimes you have to be brave enough to speak up. The day ended with an unexpected visitor. A representative from the National Medical Association arrived to announce that City General would receive their highest award for healthcare equality. But the real reward was in the daily success stories of patients receiving fair, equal care. As the sun set on the celebration, Sarah and Marcus stood looking at the plaque again. "Mom," Marcus said thoughtfully, "remember when you said we get revenge?" Sarah smiled. "This was the best kind of revenge, wasn't it? We didn't just fix one problem, we changed the whole system." The emergency room doors slid open behind them as new patients arrived. They watched as the staff sprang into action, providing the same high level of care to everyone who entered. The real victory wasn't in punishing one prejudiced doctor. It was in creating a system where such discrimination couldn't happen again. Outside, the hospital's new motto shone in bright letters. Equal care, every patient, every time. It wasn't just words on a wall anymore. It was a promise kept, a standard maintained, and a legacy that would continue saving lives for generations to come. The brutal revenge against discrimination had turned out to be something beautiful, lasting change that made the world a little bit better, one patient at a time.